Hello and welcome to York, the county town of Yorkshire in the north of England. 2,000 years of history are reflected in the city's architecture from the time of the Romans onwards. In the 19th century, York became a leading railway centre, with 2/3 of the workforce employed in jobs connected with the railways. In this programme, we'll be looking at the changing railway services in Britain. I'll talk to passengers and railway staff, and especially to the senior conductor on this train, which has just arrived at York Station on its way from Edinburgh to London. Our senior conductor is John Story. He's on the way to ask the station manager at York for help in dealing with a problem on his train.
Hello there. Hello. I have a Mrs. Taylor here for assistance.
Yeah.
Mrs. Taylor.
Mrs. Taylor. What train she just going on?
The London train.
Do you know where she's going to?
I don't.
Okay then.
Thanks so much.
I went to interview John when he was off duty. I wanted to know if it was his childhood dream to work on the railways.
It wasn't, no. When I first left school, I joined the army. And when I came out of the army, it was only through my uncle that I'd become working for the railway. I started off as a porter and then as a train guard in 1980. I became a senior conductor in 1988.
Do you think that the job of senior conductor has changed much over the years?
I do, yes. Since it was brought out in 1988, we're a lot more focused on the passengers now on the train. Whereas at one time, all we used to do was check tickets. As I say, we're a lot more involved now.
A typical day starts with John reporting for duty at Newcastle Station, where he's based.
Good morning, Gordon. Good morning, Joe.
The clerk gives John the schedule his train will be following, with times and other details.
Thank you.
He then collects his equipment for the journey and goes to join his train. In this case, it's the morning train from Aberdeen, and John is taking over as senior conductor from Newcastle to London. Finally, the catering crew joins the train, and John's daily shift begins. After each station, the senior conductor has to announce where and when the train will stop.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Senior conductor John Story speaking. Welcome to passengers who have just boarded the train at Durham Station. The 11:44 departure. Great North Eastern Railway service to London King's Cross. Calling at Darlington, York, Doncaster, Peterborough. Scheduled to arrive at London King's Cross at 14:40.
Next, he checks tickets and answers questions from passengers.
Excuse me, could you tell me the time the train connecting from Leeds to York, please?
It would be at 15:40.
15:40,
From
thanks a
York.
lot. That's
Thank
great.
When the train is crowded, some passengers decide to move from the standard class carriages and take first class seats.
class ticket, sir. They sit in first class accommodation.
Is it possible to sit in first class
And upgrade your ticket?
and pay the extra, please?
Certainly. That will cost you £46, sir.
Do you take credit cards?
I do, yes.
This passenger must pay the excess, the difference between the standard fare and first class, so he has to buy an excess travel ticket. When you travel by train, you can buy a single ticket to your destination or a return ticket there and back at first class or standard rates. But the fares you pay can vary a lot. There are many discounted fares and bargains costing less than the regular fare. For example, you can save money if you purchase a ticket in advance. The cost also varies at different times of day. Travel at off-peak times is less expensive than during the rush hour. And there are often bargains at weekends and on public holidays. It also saves money to buy weekly and season tickets for going to work. There are rail cards which give discounts to families and young people, and there are also rail cards for senior citizens, people over 60. What sort of problems do you have to deal with on the train?
There's numerous problems we have on the train. Basically, you get a lot of people boarding the wrong trains. There's, you know, they come into a station, they get confused, and they end up going the wrong direction.
It'll be the next one in.
Okay, right, thanks a lot.
And then once they're on the train, they have to sit in the wrong seat. They have seat reservations and they misread the seat reservations and end up sitting in somebody else's seat. And we have people losing their luggage, you know, quite often.
And I think you've also told me about a funny occasion of something else being left at stations.
Oh, yeah. I had a lady boarded the train. She had 2 children with her, and it wasn't until about 10 minutes into the journey she'd realised she'd left her youngest child on the platform and the pram. So I had to deal with her.
Do you have any passengers with special requests or special needs?
We have a lot of disabled passengers travelling with us, and we have disabled accommodation on board the train, you know, for people in wheelchairs. These people are met at the station and they're assisted onto the train.
How long does your daily shift last?
Approximately 8 hours.
What's your favourite route?
My favourite route would be the London route.
Do you get different people getting on the train in London, say, to the people who get on the train at Newcastle?
Yeah. You get a lot of commuters from London that would travel to, like, Peterborough, which is the first station, approximately 45 minutes out of London. But you get a lot of businessmen and they're travelling on the trains.
Finally, are you a train spotter in your spare time?
I am definitely not a train spotter in my spare time. Once I leave work, I don't want anything to do with trains. Although, after saying that, since 1980, I've always kept a log of the trains I've worked, with all the numbers and everything. So just in case I need reports on anything. So I've got all the trains I've worked going back to 1980.
So you are a train spotter?
Not intentionally.
For more than 100 years, Britain's railways were privately owned, but 50 years ago they were nationalised, taken into public ownership. Now they've been sold back to private enterprise. Selling the railways was one of the many big privatisation measures carried out by the United Kingdom's last Conservative government. For many years, some big industries like coal and steel, and also public services and so-called utilities like water and electricity, were in public ownership. They were owned and run by the state. and the money that financed or subsidized them came from the taxpayer. In recent years, several of these have been sold to private enterprise. They are now owned and run by companies which are financed by private investment. Privatization means that newly privatized companies are sold on the London Stock Exchange so that shares in them can be bought by private investors and institutions. The Great North Eastern Railway, or GNER, is the privatized company which operates the route from London to Edinburgh. I spoke to Chris Garnett, the Chief Executive Officer of GNER. When were the railways privatized in Britain?
The first train franchises for operating the trains was let at the end of 1995. The vast bulk of it, the selling of the tracks, the rolling stock and so on, was 1996, with the last of the train franchises going during 1997.
You mentioned the sale of the rolling stock. What was actually privatized, the routes, the rails, or the trains?
There were a number of parts. It was split into an enormous number of different sections. But the substantial parts were Railtrack was a company that was created, and they own all the infrastructure, the track, the tunnels, the signalling, and the stations. And that got sold, privatized on the London Stock Exchange during the early part of 1996. The rolling stock leasing companies were the people who took on, three companies were created to take on the passenger rolling stock, and they own all the rolling stock. Then the main passenger network in the UK was split into 25 different units. And they have been let as management contracts or franchises in periods between 7 and 15 years. And those franchises, those operating companies, pay Railtrack to run the trains on Railtrack's track, and they hire the rolling stock from the Roscoes.
The three parts of the British passenger railway system were privatised separately and now belong to separate companies. The infrastructure belongs to Railtrack, which owns and runs the track, the stations, the signalling systems and the staff to operate all of these. The rolling stock, consisting of the trains themselves, is owned by the rolling stock leasing companies, sometimes called Roscoes. The rolling stock is leased or hired out to the passenger network through the train operating companies, each of which manages and operates its own part of the network. All these companies hold franchises, which are contracts with the government to run their part of the system for a franchise period of between 7 and 15 years. So, what improvements have you actually seen since privatisation?
One has been in service to passengers. It's been getting across to everybody, particularly on our route, that nobody has to travel by train. We are in enormous competition with the airlines, with cars, with coaches. And so it's been, how do we raise passenger standards? How do we give you a good service? There's also been some very aggressive marketing. We're like an airline. We have space to sell. So you can sell cheap tickets in advance at discounted prices, and then if you turn up at the last minute, you pay more. So that's filled up our trains, and we're taking about 10% more people. So that's been one thing. The other has been about making the system more efficient, getting more trains into service, having more reliable trains, having clean trains in winter. And so it's been efficiency, it's been service, it's been providing a better railway.
Can you imagine the railways ever being nationalised again?
I think not really. I mean, it's very interesting just talking to staff. I was coming down on the train the other day with a driver and said to him, he'd been in the business 44 years. I said, how do you find it? He said, well, if you told me that I would think privatisation was a good thing, I wouldn't believe you. But now I say this has come 40 years too late. And he's not alone in saying that. I think the staff have really been quite surprised how much better it all is. York Station was designed and built in the 1870s.
It's one of the finest examples of Victorian railway architecture, and at the time it was considered to be the largest railway station in the world. The iron Corinthian pillars and the arched roof which they support are the principal design features. They led to the station being called a splendid monument of extravagance. The station is now owned by Railtrack, and I spoke to Nigel Stacey, Railtrack's manager, who is responsible for the station. Nigel, what are you in charge of? The trains or the station or both?
Principally, I'm just in charge of the station. I have 3 stations, York, Darlington and Durham. I don't have any real responsibility for the trains, except when they're here in the stations, when we're responsible for the safety of the passengers joining and leaving and the dispatch of those trains to time.
Who are the people that work for you?
I have 80 staff. They range from station announcers, one of whom you can hear in the background, to platform staff, customer information staff on the stations, and a number of cleaning staff as well.
Are you also in charge of the senior conductors?
No, John has his own manager, who is part of the on-train management organisation. Normally the only contact we would have at the station with the senior conductors is as the train is standing in the station, and of course we need to relay information between the train and the station, and we would do that through the senior conductor.
Can I ask you one last personal question?
Of course.
You haven't always been a station manager, have you?
No. I started on the railway in 1985 as a train driver, or trainee train driver, and I drove trains for about 4.5 years, and then moved through a supervisory job and eventually into management jobs, and I started here 3 years ago, just with York, and then last year I took over Darlington and Durham stations as well.
What was it like driving trains?
It was great. Sometimes I'd love to go back to it. The glamour, and there's still a romance to it, I think, that you can't take away, especially for either the very big freight trains or for the long distance passenger trains. And so in that sense, yes, I'd love to go back to it. However, I think now I've moved on from it personally in terms of my own development, and I'm much happier really doing what I do now. But it was a wonderful time.
York Station is no longer the largest in the world, but it's still very crowded and busy. I boarded a train which had John Story as its chief conductor. He was returning to his base at Newcastle. Once the train had started, I talked to some of the passengers about their travelling habits and preferences. Do you prefer travelling by train or by car?
Definitely prefer travelling by train.
Are you travelling on business or for private reasons?
On business.
Where are you travelling to?
I'm travelling to Durham to a factory, food factory.
Are you travelling for private reasons or on business?
I'm on business, but I'm also on pleasure because I'm heading home.
Where's home?
Home's near Newcastle on Tyne, and I've been to London.
Do you have any complaints about the railway system?
I think the East Coast line, which is the train that we're on, provides a very good service. Unfortunately, we were 1.5 hours late yesterday going to London, but that was because somebody had decided to commit suicide on the line, nothing to do with the railway itself.
Do you think the rail service has improved or deteriorated since privatisation?
I'm not sure really, because I'm not really old enough to know, but I think it's got a little bit better. I think more trains are on time, but the prices have gone up, but the prices of everything have gone up, so that's probably just indicative of that, really.
This line has probably got better. I travelled mostly on this line, but it was a very good line beforehand. So the difference is probably in terms of the public relations and maybe the catering.
I had a chance to talk to one of the catering staff about her work on the London to Newcastle line. When and where did you start work today?
I started work at King's Cross and at 6:30 in the morning.
How long will you have to work for today?
About 14 hours. I finish at 20:38. We get in at, back to King's Cross at 20 to 9, so that's around 14 hours.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your city conductor. We will shortly arrive in now to Newcastle. Please consult the station departure screen for your onward service or request the assistance of the station staff. Our Southend onward train team would like to thank you for just travel with Great North Eastern Railway, and we look forward to working with you soon.
John Story's shift is almost over. We'll leave his train as it approaches Newcastle station to look at some of the history of rail travel in Britain. As a result of the Industrial Revolution in England, canals were used to transport goods around the country as freight. But very soon, steam engines began to take freight on fixed rail tracks, and in 1830, passengers were carried by rail for the first time. By 1850, there were 10,000 kilometres of rail track in Britain. By 1920, the track had increased to 32,000 kilometres, with 6,500 passenger stations and 2,500 freight stations. In the last 35 years, however, a lot of track and many stations have been closed down, and now there are only 16,500 kilometres of track and a total of 2,500 stations for passengers and freight. Rail transport has declined as a result of competition from cars and lorries, especially for long journeys. But there have been improvements in rail travel, and the traditional sea ferries across the English Channel now have a rival in the Channel Tunnel, which can take 600 trains every day. In the National Railway Museum in York, there's a model of the Channel Tunnel in the Great Hall next to the Rocket, Robert Stephenson's first steam engine. The museum houses a collection of locomotives from the earliest years to the present day. You can also see the first royal trains with carriages used by Queen Victoria. The city of York was a residence for several Roman emperors. Later it became a centre of Christianity. The city's most famous building is York Minster, the largest Gothic cathedral in Britain. One of the Minster's greatest treasures is the stained glass in its windows. The rose window here commemorates the union of the royal families of York and Lancaster in the 15th century. Part of the minster was severely damaged in a fire in 1984. It has since been restored. The oldest part of the medieval city is full of narrow streets. This is the Shambles, once the Street of Butchers. York has long been famous for chocolates and confectionery. This is Bootham Bar, one of the 4 remaining medieval gates. We finish our programme with another train journey, this time on the North Yorkshire Moors Railway, which makes its way through the beautiful scenery of the North Yorkshire Moors National Park. The steam locomotives and old carriages have been restored and maintained by railway enthusiasts. The railway itself follows the route of Stephenson's original line, opened in 1836. My visit came at the time of a Victorian railway festival which celebrated 150 years of steam traffic along this line. People dressed up for the festivities, which took place in the little town of Pickering. That's all from the railways. I hope you can join me again next time when we'll be in Scotland. Goodbye.